And joining us for more on the Israeli perspective of what's really happening as far as Iran's attack last night is concerned, joining us is Eran Etzion. He's a former deputy head of the National Security Council of Israel. Thank you so much, Mr. Etzion, for speaking to Times Now. Firstly, sir, what do you make of the Iranian attack, and how do you think Israel should be responding to this?
Well, the problem is for everybody, including your viewers, that it's very difficult to begin telling a story from the current moment. It's obviously an ongoing story. This is not an attack that simply happened without any context and without any timeline and without any previous events. We are essentially at war with Iran, even though it's not official. There is no declaration of war, as far as I know, not by the Iranians and not by us. But we are, for all practical purposes, in a situation of war. The big difference between what has been happening since October 7th and what happened last night is the direct involvement of Iran, but even that is not unprecedented. As some of our viewers may remember, back in April, Iran already launched a very similar barrage of missiles and drones and other flying objects into Israel, and was rebuffed by a coalition of Israel, the US, Jordan, and a number of other Arab countries. What happened last night is pretty similar. The scope of the attack was slightly bigger. The missiles used were more heavy, and the targets were more, shall we say, precise. And now Israel is releasing some information that some of the rockets actually hit their targets in various air bases in Israel.
Right.
So this is, in terms of the level of hits, it is, we can say, unprecedented. But it comes, again, as within the context of a long series of mutual attacks, not necessarily direct, mostly indirect, by Iranian proxies, such as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and obviously Hezbollah in Lebanon.
You know, in terms of an airstrike, the likely possibility, many are speculating, is possibly, the nuclear assets that Iran has, for instance, because that could be an important point strategically.
Well, attacking a nuclear facility in any country is an enormous undertaking with global implications. It's something that Israel did twice in its history, once in Iraq and once in Syria. And while there was a lot of talk in recent years about a possible Israeli attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities, it was never really in the making. And yes, now there is talk again. I would venture a speculation or an assessment that it won't happen.
Right.
The main reason it won't happen is that Israel needs the Americans for this kind of an attack. And as far as I can assess the American position, at least now, 30-something days before their elections, this is not something that falls anywhere near their national interest or their political interest.
But let me also, respond to you on the point of regime change, because, we've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu distinctly, separate the regime and the people of Iran when he addressed the people there. Now, is that regime change a question that may perhaps be too ambitious? Is that something that is really feasible? There's been a lot of debate surrounding that. How do you look at it?
It's a very good and important question, and I would make the exact 2 points that you made. I'll elaborate a little bit. The first point is that, yes, there needs to be a differentiation, a distinction between the regime and the people of Iran, because there is such a distinction in reality, and this is an autocratic, vicious regime that is fighting against the majority of its own population. The population would like very much to have a very different regime. That is not to say that there's no support whatsoever for the regime, but most of the Iranians would very much like to see a very different regime. So it's the interest of Israel, it's the interest, if I can say so, of India, it's in the interest of the global community to make this distinction again and again and again.
Now, IDF has said that there were no hits on fighter jets, soldiers, or significant operational infrastructure in yesterday's missile attacks. On the other hand, Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard says that 90% of the missiles it launched against Israel have hit their targets successfully. And the Times of Israel has reported that a number of impact sites have been identified across Israel with images of missile fragments that have been circulating on social media. An exact location of such impacts and damage are barred from publication by the IDF censor. So what's the ground situation in Israel? Do you think the country has been hit worse than we are being led to believe? What's the real situation on ground?
I take it you don't have your own reporter in Israel right now, right?
We don't.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
If you did have one, he or she would be able to walk freely throughout the entire country of Israel and see for himself or herself that what the Iranians are suggesting is very, very far from reality. They launched approximately 180 ballistic missiles. If 90% of them would have really landed and made an impact, this is not something that anybody would be in a position to hide in the state of Israel. So I would say, I would guarantee personally, and I would invite your reporter or any reporter to look around in Israel and try and find out those how much would it be? 90% of 180, 160 sites of direct hits of Iranian missiles. Right. They're nowhere to be found because, as Israel says correctly, the vast majority were intercepted. But again, as I said at the very beginning, in comparison to other attacks, including the previous Iranian attack and other attacks by Hezbollah, years ago by Saddam Hussein and others, obviously attacks by Hamas over the years, this is relative, the number of hits and the measure of accuracy of those hits, the fact that they hit actual Air Force bases in Israel, is unprecedented and is, from an Iranian perspective, an achievement. One cannot deny that.
Right. Also, of course, as far as the US's support is concerned, how big a factor is this? Because, in the sense that we've seen already fighting on the front of Gaza for over a year, there are many who are now speculating that given the fact that there are multiple fronts, as you rightly mentioned, that this fighting is something that could be looked at as a very long drawn and protracted war. Where would you, in fact, be looking at, and how would you be looking at what's happened last night and the kind of response that can be expected to this? And do you think that Iran, in your view, has the ability to sustain a long-drawn battle if that does happen?
Well, you're touching a very sensitive and sad point. This has been the longest war in Israel's history and the most painful one from many points of view. We are about to commemorate the first annual point in time for October 7th in just a few days. There is planned, at least, a mass gathering organized by the families of the victims and the hostages in a huge park in Israel, and approximately 60,000 people registered for that already. I hope they'll be able to do it and that there won't be any missile alert or anything like that. And the whole country will be in more than a day. It'll be a week or even weeks of very deep national grief. And it's not something that we're used to here in Israel. Not my generation, not my children's generation, some of whom have been fighting in Gaza and now in Lebanon, and not even for my parents' generation, who have grown, who went through the entire gamut of previous Israeli wars. So this is something extremely serious and extremely grave and sad. And nobody wants to see another commemoration a year from now of the second year of this war. So it's definitely within Israel's interest to cut this war short, to achieve as much as possible, to close the file. We also need to go as quickly as possible for national elections because we have a government which is completely illegitimate. 70% of the population want general elections immediately. We also need to replace the entire military higher echelons that are also responsible for the horrific failure of October 7th. So there is a lot of internal reform that needs to take place, and it's going to be very difficult to do that during active war.
Right, right. And, it's not just about Gaza or Lebanon, but also potentially Iran. But the question that I'd like to ask is, what is the role that you foresee for international diplomacy in mitigating this conflict? Because at the United Nations, at various other fora, we've seen different countries appeal to Israel to not allow for it to escalate further. Do you see diplomacy really playing a role, given what has happened yesterday?
I absolutely see diplomacy playing a role. I'm a diplomat by training, and I believe, and that is also my understanding, that every war ends with a diplomatic agreement. This has been our experience, including with the skirmishes that we had with Hamas in Gaza over the years, even though it's an non-state actors. There was always some kind of an agreement, official or unofficial, written or non-written, between us and Hamas that put an end to each one of those violent rounds that we encountered over the years. And this time around, because it's much bigger, there's going to have to be a much deeper and more formal closure by means of, yes, a diplomatic agreement. And there is such an agreement, a comprehensive agreement that was on the table, that was put on the table by the Biden administration a number of weeks after October 7th and was negotiated ever since. It's the so-called Biden plan, that calls for a hostage release, followed by a ceasefire, first temporary and then permanent in Gaza, then a ceasefire in Lebanon, and then on to the regional security architecture based on the American-Saudi deal.
Right.
Now, admittedly, that's not feasible in the 30 days that we have between now and American elections.
Right.
If there is a Harris administration, I believe this will be more or less the outline for the final outcome of this conflict. If there is a Trump administration, all bets are off. Yesterday, he said he's going to opt for an agreement. The day before, he said he's going to attack Iran. You never know with this guy.
But one of the criticisms has been of Israel in the past are the large number of civilian casualties that we've been seeing in the various fronts and the fighting that has been taking place. What are the steps that Israel can take to reduce the civilian harm? Because this negatively impacts upon the image of Israel internationally and at the same time pursuing its military objectives.
It's a real tension and a real difficulty. I am not a military professional. I'm a diplomat. So I'm not an expert on, for example, comparing the ratio of collateral damage and civilian or non-combatant fatalities in the conflict in Gaza compared to, let's say, the conflict in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Somalia.
Right.
But Israeli experts are saying that our ratio is actually better. And that the 40-something thousand number that everybody's using as a number for casualties in Gaza, in fact, includes all the Hamas fighters that were killed. And according to Israeli figures, if I remember correctly, these number are around 20,000. So approximately 50% of those killed are definitely terrorists.
Right.
And while it may sound unpleasant and difficult, and I sympathize with that, this is an acceptable ratio as far as modern combat, and especially in urban areas with Hamas using civilians as human shields and hiding amongst them and so on. So that would be, I agree with you that it does complicate Israel's position in global public opinion, but the military is trying to do whatever it can to mitigate it.
All right, Mr. Eran Etzion, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us here on Times Now.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.